The content presented in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. The narratives discussed are based on historical cases, generally 40 years or older, using publicly available information, reconstructed storytelling, and interpretive analysis. While care is taken to present events accurately, certain elements may be condensed, adapted, or presented for narrative clarity. The psychological insights and analyses offered are speculative in nature and do not constitute formal diagnoses, clinical evaluations, or definitive conclusions about any individual's mental state, intent, or behavior. This podcast does not provide medical, psychological, or legal advice. Listeners should not substitute any information presented here for professional consultation with qualified practitioners. All views expressed are intended to explore patterns of human behavior and decision-making, not to assign guilt, establish fact, or replace official findings. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to The Missing Why. People will tell you what they did. Some will even tell you how they did it. But the why is almost always edited or buried, because the real reasons are rarely clean. They're shaped by fear, by ambition, by ego, by pressure that never makes it into the story. Every decision leaves a trace. Every action exposes a pattern. And most people spend their lives hoping no one looks closely enough to connect them. This is where we do. We study the fracture points, the contradictions, the quiet motives operating behind composed language and controlled appearances. Because beneath every polished narrative, there is something else. And once you see it, you don't unsee it. It's Christmas Eve, not the version people remember, not the one with music and warmth. The other one, the quiet hour after closing, when the town has already gone home. Inside a furniture store on Dillard Street, the lights are still on. Not bright, not inviting, fluorescent, cold, the kind of light that hums just enough that if you stood there long enough, you'd start to hear it. 4 people are inside. By the end of the night, all 4 will be dead. And one man will still be standing, bleeding, disoriented, alive. And that will be the problem. You're listening to The Missing Why. We don't just examine events. We examine the structures that make those events inevitable. Because what happens is rarely the full story. Today, a furniture store, a controlled environment, a family system, and a version of the truth that may have settled before the evidence ever did. Winter Garden in 1975 moves slowly. not because it has to, but because it chooses to. It's a place where routine becomes identity and predictability becomes a form of trust. You don't question the system because the system works. At the center of that system is Tommy Zeigler, a business owner, a husband, a fixed point inside a stable environment. His store isn't just a store, it's controlled space. Everything inside it has a place. The furniture, the lighting, the pathways people walk. Nothing is accidental, which makes what happens next structurally disruptive. Because when violence enters a controlled space, it forces a question. Who lost control? The first thing to understand is the sound. Gunfire inside a closed building doesn't behave the way people imagine. It doesn't disperse. It compresses. It hits walls, returns, overlaps itself. 30 shots don't sound like 30. They sound like chaos folding in on itself. Then silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that comes after something irreversible. When authorities arrive, the scene isn't just violent. It's layered. Bodies positioned in different areas. Some shot. Some beaten. A metal crank becomes part of the story. Not because it was meant to be, but because something escalated past control. And in the middle of it, Zeigler, alive, wounded, present. The human mind does not tolerate unresolved chaos well, so it begins to organize quickly, efficiently, sometimes prematurely. The prosecution's model is clean. This was contained. This was intentional. This was executed by someone who understood the space. That matters. Because if the environment is controlled, then the violence must be controlled too. And if both are controlled, then the survivor isn't random. He's central. So the system builds a narrative that restores order, motive, financial, location, personal, outcome, staged. It's coherent, which makes it believable. But reality doesn't always stay aligned with coherence. Over time, small inconsistencies begin to surface. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. The kind that don't break a story, but start to bend it. blood patterns that don't fully map, timelines that feel compressed, witness accounts that don't quite stabilize. Then decades pass, and something changes. Technology catches up. DNA enters the conversation. And now the question isn't what story makes sense. It's what does the physical world actually support? Because evidence doesn't care about narrative. It either fits or it doesn't. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Once a system commits to a version of events, it doesn't just store that version. It organizes around it. Every new piece of information is filtered. Does this confirm what we know, or does it threaten it? And if it threatens it, it isn't always rejected. Sometimes it's reinterpreted, reshaped, absorbed. Because changing the conclusion doesn't just change the outcome. It calls into question the investigation, the decisions, and the people who made them, which raises the cost of being wrong. Now step back. Remove the narrative. Just observe the behavior. If this is a controlled act, it requires precision under pressure, consistency across multiple victims, and the ability to simulate chaos without losing control. If it's not, then what you're looking at is escalation, noise, disruption, improvisation, and the scene contains elements of both, which is where the tension lives, not in what's proven, but in what doesn't fully resolve. This is narrative lock, control preservation. A system identifies a stable explanation early. That explanation reduces uncertainty. And once adopted, it becomes resistant to revision. Not because it's perfect, but because it's functional. This case isn't just about Tommy Zeigler. It's about the moment a system decides this is what happened. Because from that point forward, the goal is no longer discovery. It's alignment. And the longer that alignment holds, the more it begins to feel like truth, even if parts of it never fully fit. The lights in that store were left on long after the noise stopped, long after the bodies were found, long after the story was written. And maybe that's the most accurate detail of all. Because even now, decades later, Something about this case is still illuminated, not resolved, just visible. And the real question is no longer just who did it. It's what made one version of the truth stick. This episode examines historical criminal cases for educational and analytical purposes. Interpretations are based on publicly available information and are not definitive claims of guilt or innocence. What you just heard is a clean narrative. It moves with structure. It stabilizes itself. It gives you something to hold on to. But cases like this don't live in the narrative. They live in the tension between what makes sense and what actually holds under pressure. So the question now isn't just what happened in that store. It's why one explanation was strong enough to take hold, and whether it actually explains the behavior it's trying to contain. The central motive presented is financial, life insurance, economic gain, and at a surface level, that works. It's familiar. It's easy to process. It gives the violence a purpose that feels rational. But when you move from theory into behavior, that motive starts to strain. Because what's being proposed isn't a single act. It's not impulsive. It's not contained. It's a multi-stage event involving multiple victims inside a known environment with an alleged attempt to control the aftermath. That requires more than motive. That requires sustained execution under pressure. There's a difference between wanting an outcome and being able to carry it out. People have financial stress all the time. People think about escape, about relief, about removing constraints. But very few cross the threshold into coordinated violence. And fewer still do it in a way that requires composure, sequencing, and post-event manipulation. So if the financial motive is real, it can't be the whole story. It has to be part of a larger internal structure, something already active, something already building. Because money alone doesn't explain proximity. These weren't distant targets. This was his wife, her parents, people embedded in his daily reality. Violence at that distance inside a family system is rarely just instrumental. It's usually layered. Resentment, pressure, identity conflict, perceived entrapment. Financial incentive might justify the act, but it usually isn't what creates the emotional conditions for it. Then there's the scene itself. Two different forms of violence: gunfire and blunt force. That matters more than it seems. Controlled acts tend to be consistent. They follow a pattern because consistency reduces risk, but mixed methods induce friction. They suggest either that the plan degraded in real time or that control was never fully established to begin with. And if control breaks down, then the original premise that this was a clean, financially motivated execution becomes harder to sustain. The most demanding part of the prosecution's theory is the idea of self-inflicted injury. Not just that it happened, but that it was integrated into the sequence. Because now you're asking one individual to manage multiple victims, maintain situational awareness, and then deliberately injure himself in a way that supports a narrative without collapsing the plan. That's a very narrow behavioral window. It's possible, but it raises the threshold significantly. Because now the motive has to justify not just violence, but precision under extreme stress, including self-harm. Now, invert it. If he didn't do it, the structure changes completely. There is no central motive. There is no need for consistency. The scene doesn't have to resolve cleanly because it was never controlled by a single actor. In that model, the inconsistencies aren't problems. They're expected. Mixed methods make sense. Survival becomes incidental, not strategic. And that's where the case becomes difficult, because both interpretations can absorb parts of the evidence, but neither resolves everything cleanly. So why does the financial motive persist? Because it compresses the case. It takes something complex and reduces it to a sentence. He wanted money. That's cognitively efficient. It gives the system something stable to operate on. It allows decisions to be made, verdicts to be reached, and narratives to hold over time. But efficiency isn't the same as explanatory power. A motive can make a story easier to accept without actually accounting for the behavior it's supposed to explain. And that's the distinction that matters here. Not just whether a motive exists, but whether that motive can carry the weight of what happened. Because if it can't, then what you're left with isn't resolution. It's alignment. A version of events that holds together just well enough to function, even if parts of it never fully fit. And that brings us back to the real question. Not just who did it, but what made one explanation strong enough to become the truth, and whether that strength came from evidence or from the system's need for the story to stabilize. Because once a narrative like that takes hold, it doesn't just describe reality. This was the missing why. If something felt off, it's because it was supposed to. Most people don't want clarity. They want coherence. Something that sounds right, even if it isn't. But the truth doesn't behave that way. It exposes. It disrupts. It forces you to confront the difference between what you believe and what's actually driving you. So before you move on, examine your own decisions. Not the version you explain to others, the one you avoid explaining to yourself. Because that's where everything starts. And whether you acknowledge it or not, it's already shaping what happens next.